Good morning. I'm Kristine Monroe. I'm an assistant professor of preventive medicine at the Keck School of Medicine, and today I am interviewing Dr. Brian Henderson, the Kenneth T. Norris Distinguished Professor of Preventive Medicine. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Chris. Thank you.
Dr. Henderson and I have been working together since 1988, so for
Close to 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah, close to 20 years.
And the purpose today is to give background about his career at the Keck School of Medicine. But I'd like to start today with your background. Will you tell us a little bit about your early background, how you got involved?
Thank you, Chris, for doing this, by the way. Thank you very much. So Chris and I put together she's worked hard to put together the background for this interview. And let me start a little bit with how I came to the Keck School. So I grew up in Northern California, and I was born in San Francisco, grew up in the Bay Area, went to Berkeley, UC Berkeley.
Cal Bear,
yeah, graduated from there. And in those days, I just applied to medical school at the nearest place, which was UC San Francisco. That was the only medical school I applied to. That's where I went. I was there 2 years, and then I was poor, like everybody else, living in a basement of an apartment building on Judas Street in San Francisco. And I went to a medical school fraternity party. I didn't belong to the fraternity, but all of us were invited. And there I met an airline hostess. They invited nurses and airline hostesses to these parties. So anyway, I met an airline hostess who was flying with TWA.
Okay.
Very glamorous. And she eventually became my wife, Judith McDermott Henderson. Anyway, Judith lived in a nice house in the Haight-Ashbury area. That was back when it was a nice area, like it is now, with 3 other airline stewardesses. So I had the bonus of a place to study where there was light and beautiful surroundings, and you could get food. And so anyway, that was our romance blossomed. We got married in the summer of my sophomore year. And because my wife was from Chicago, we moved to Chicago. I transferred to the University of Chicago Medical School.
Okay.
And I finished my last 2 years there.
Okay.
And then we spent part of my senior year on a field project in Colombia, South America. I was interested in international medicine by that time. Then I went for my internship and residency at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Went to CDC, where I worked on yellow fever, and eventually in 1970 came to the Keck School.
Did you specialize in any particular area of medicine?
And at the Mass General, I was in internal medicine residency. And all of us faced the draft in those days. So in lieu of going into the armed forces, I went into the public health service after the first 2 years of my residency, as most of us did. And most of my colleagues at the Mass General went to NIH. I went to CDC in Atlanta because I was interested in international medicine, and I was hoping I could sort of wangle an overseas assignment, which I did.
Which you did.
Yep. So I got transferred to, I arranged my transfer to Entebbe, Uganda, and to a virus research institute there, where we lived for about 4 years.
Well, tell us what you were researching in Uganda.
So it was this was a Rockefeller Foundation lab that was built in the late 30s when they were trying to discover the jungle cycle of yellow fever. So yellow fever caused periodic epidemics in Africa and in the Americas. And there was a dispute over where was the virus when it wasn't epidemic. And so work was done mainly out of this lab in Entebbe in the 30s and 40s showing, and into the 50s, showing that it was maintained in the forest among monkeys, particularly gray monkeys. So the lab was there. It had transferred to African control, Ugandan control, post-British independence from Britain. And I went there to study yellow fever.
Interesting. Would you say that that was the transition point from medical doctor to epidemiologist?
It was. Yeah, I would say before that I hadn't really a clue what I was going to do. Except when I was at UC San Francisco, there was, in the first week of the freshman lectures, there was a lecture given by a fairly famous California scientist, Carl F. Meyer. Carl F. Meyer was the man who taught the canning industry how to get rid of botulism.
Oh.
And he worked on plague. Anyway, he gave this lecture one afternoon with slides of working on plague in India and on God knows what disease all over the world, and that's what he had done. And the lecture was supposed to be an hour. He went on for about 3 hours. Most everybody left.
Except you.
Except me. So I thought it so fascinating. I thought, well, this sounds like what I'd like to do. And of course, that was sort of epidemiology. That's really what
Right.
it was doing. So that's why I think, drifted that way because that was my interest.
Okay. For the people that may watch this tape in the future who may not know what an epidemiologist is, provide that explanation.
So epidemiology, to me, is sort of the study of disease patterns in human populations.
Mm-hmm.
And it started with epidemics of things like cholera in London by Snow, and the work on yellow fever by people like Walter Reed and Carlos Finley.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was doing infectious disease epidemiology, which was taught at CDC in Atlanta. That was the center for creating epidemiologists in the 60s. I'd say there and Harvard School of Public Health and O'Brien McMahon. Those were the two big centers where epidemiologists were trained. And then I ended up, as I say, in Africa really doing epidemiology, studying viruses, both yellow fever and other viruses.
Now, your research career at USC has primarily been in cancer epidemiology.
Right.
Tell us when you came to USC and how then you transitioned into cancer epidemiology.
So a short answer is I got back from Africa as one of the world's expert on yellow fever in 1969. I had 4 children by then, and there hadn't been a case of yellow fever in the United States since 1908. So my job prospects didn't look really exciting.
Right.
So that's the short answer. I figured I needed a real career. But the real transition occurred in Africa, interestingly. I was studying yellow fever. There were other people in Uganda at that time studying Burkitt's lymphoma, which was and still is, a disease, a lymphoma of children in Africa, in the tropical belt of Africa, that caused very bizarre and awful jaw tumors and abdominal tumors in young African kids. And Dennis Burkitt in 50s had described this, actually 57 I think, described this tumor in the literature, and later working with some of the people at the virus lab where I went in Entebbe, demonstrated that it was only seen in the belt where there were mosquitoes, where malaria was present. And so he linked it to holoendemic malaria, chronic challenge to the immune system and stuff. I started studying it because it looked like it could be mosquito-borne, and ran into Malcolm Pike there, who'd come to Uganda from England, and others. And so I sort of transitioned to Burkitt's lymphoma, then to nasopharyngeal carcinoma, and started my, if you will, my transition to cancer interests even while I was in Africa.
Well, that's actually a really good explanation. I think it provides background for people understanding then how you came to start to study cancer. So talk now a little bit about when you came to USC and what department you were a part of.
1970, Richard Nixon signed the Cancer Act.
Mm-hmm.
Cancer in 1970 was a big black box. Increasing incidence of cancers and not very much known about cancer. So he signed this law and a lot of money was suddenly available. And there was a famous scientist at the National Cancer Institute, Robert Huebner. Huebner had already started a program at USC funding Murray Gardner in pathology, working on mouse viruses, and Bob McAllister over at Children's Hospital studying children's cancer. And suddenly all this money's available, and Huebner has this idea, well, why don't we take advantage of Los Angeles' multiethnic population and study human cancer, epidemiology, causation. And he knew me from meetings we had in Kenya, actually, in 1969, of all places. Recruited me from CDC to come to USC and join Murray Gardner and begin the human side of Murray's mouse virus program. And he gave me 3 years, said, write what you want to do, told me what to write. I did it on a page and a half, and then he gave me $1 million a year for 3 years to get started.
My gosh.
Yeah, in those days, that was a lot of money.
Still is a lot of
For
money.
a page and a half.
Yeah. So what department at that time, when you came to USC, what department?
Pathology, because Hugh Edmondson was chairman of the department then.
Okay.
Hugh had sponsored Murray, who was a real pathologist. So there really was no place for me with my background and training that made sense except pathology. So I became an associate professor of pathology in 1970 when I arrived.
Okay. So what was your role in the establishment of the Department of Preventive Medicine then?
So there was a Department of Community Medicine and Public Health or something like that. And that, I think, was run by I forget who ran it in those days. It was a relatively small department. Bob Tranquata was in it. Not very many other people. It was a small group of people. I could have belonged to that department, but I didn't. I was in pathology. I went to Oxford and I recruited Malcolm Pike to come and join me in 72. I actually conned him into coming. I thought it was clever at the time. They were living in a small condo at Oxford. Housing there was not very exciting for young faculty. And he was married. They had 3 kids. So I found them a beachfront place in Palos Verdes.
Oh my gosh.
To rent for the summer they visited, and that sort of did it.
Yeah.
So then I got Malcolm, and then I got Tom Mack to come from Harvard School of Public Health to join this epidemiology program.
Mm-hmm.
Malcolm came into the Department of Community Medicine because they had some statistics interests, and Tom Mack joined me in preventive medicine, in pathology. So there was nothing else with the department until 1978. By then, our group had grown. John Peters had come from Harvard School of Public Health. We had a lot of young faculty, Ron Ross, Mimi Yu. We were getting bigger and bigger, and Alan Mathias, who was dean then, asked me to take over a new department of family and preventive medicine in 1978. So we took the remnants of this community health or community medicine department and a sort of a small family medicine department, put them together, and that was really the first department.
Talk about what your research interests were then at that time.
So we had this money from Huebner, and there are two things I did. The first was to realize that, like any disease in epidemiology, you have to know who's getting cancer before you can even begin to ask why. So we started in 1971, really John Histrick, Susan Preston Martin, and others, going to all the pathologists in what were then 184 hospitals in Los Angeles and convincing them all to let us know about every one of their newly diagnosed cancer cases. So it was a voluntary cancer registry that we started with money from Huebner and from the NCI, National Cancer Institute. And then on that background of all these newly reported cases, we built small case control studies. You know, we did one of nasopharyngeal carcinoma, one of testis cancer, one of breast cancer, trying to begin to understand what we could learn about the exposures of people with cancer to people who didn't have cancer. And that was our sort of what began the cancer program we have now.
Okay. I wanted you just to give a real brief description of a case control study, again, just so that people understand.
Knows. So case control studies, which are the hallmark of really a lot of our early work, still our ongoing work, take advantage of all newly diagnosed cases of cancer in a period of time in a defined area, and then some system of getting controls, comparable people. Doesn't really make any difference how, as long as you find some way of getting comparable people to interview. You say, these are the questions I'm interested in. You take specimens, biological specimens, if you've got something to measure, like an antibody to a virus or whatever. You go out, and we always did this by field work. Team of nurses I had in the early days who would go to the homes of patients and the controls with a predetermined list of questions, like smoking and lung cancer, and ask questions, and then you compare the responses.
Right. Okay.
And you find out that people who get lung cancer smoked more than people who didn't. People who got breast cancer had certain characteristics, an earlier menarche and a later menopause, than people who didn't, and so on.
You just mentioned a very important point, that a lot of your career has been built on hormone-dependent cancers, particularly breast cancer. Talk a little bit about
that part. When I was both in Berkeley and UC San Francisco, it was at a time when there was in both institutions, there was a strong influence of endocrinology. I didn't realize it at the time until years later, actually, when I came to USC. But that was such a powerful influence. There was a famous mammalian endocrinologist, Howard Byrne, at UC San Francisco. And then Peter Forsham was the clinical endocrinologist at UCSF. And we were drilled with endocrinology. And how hormones circulated and what determined the levels of hormones and all the different organs involved and the different target organs. So when I came to study cancer, and I started looking at breast cancer and testis cancer, it was obvious that the hormonal milieu of the individual had a lot to do with determining their risk. And it built sort of on this strong background I already had in endocrinology.
Okay. Interesting. Now I want to discuss your membership in the Institute of Medicine. Established in 1970 under the charter of the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine provides independent, objective, evidence-based advice to policymakers, health professionals, the private sector, and the public to improve health. In what year did you become a member, and what research was cited in support of your induction?
So thank you. So I became a member in 1994.
Okay.
And by that time, I had built up a body of research primarily on endocrine-related cancers, mainly breast cancer, but endometrium and ovarian cancer and testis cancer, prostate cancer. And that was the major reason for my nomination and my election into the Institute of Medicine. But the other part of my career that sort of unfolded in those early years was I still had the wanderlust that took me to Africa in the 60s. So then I began wandering the Pacific in the 70s and 80s. I talked Alan Mathias into giving me a sabbatical to go to Papua New Guinea in 1977. And I took my whole family, and off to New Guinea we went for 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that, I started a series of meetings in the Pacific over the interesting observation that cancer rates varied enormously around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Hensel and Hirayama from Japan and others had noticed that breast cancer rates were 30-fold different, lower in Japan than the US, and prostate cancer rates were 100-fold lower in Singapore than in the United States. And yet as these populations moved to the United States, the Japanese or the Chinese, their rates tended to go up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I held a series of meetings sponsored by the National Cancer Institute in the 70s and 80s in Hawaii, which my wife and I always love. I always love to go to Hawaii.
We all do.
Yeah, we all do. And so we'd have these meetings every 3 years, bring together a small group of epidemiologists from around the Pacific, and we began to build a base of scientific interest in why these migrating cancer rates were changing. And that was the other thing that was noted in my nomination for the Institute of Medicine, both the endocrinology work and the work on cancer rates and the changing of cancer rates in migrating cancer populations in the Pacific.
I think that gives a really good background about your early research careers. I want to switch now, because we're going to come back later to talk about your current research interests, but I want to talk now about the creation of the Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center. The National Cancer Institute has designated the USC Norris Cancer Center as one of the nation's 39 comprehensive cancer centers, a select group of institutions providing leadership in cancer treatment, research, prevention, and education. USC Norris has held this designation since 1973, when it was named as one of the first 8 comprehensive cancer centers. I wanted you to discuss the history of the creation of the Cancer Center and include specifically your role.
So you were right on about 1973, and that was largely the work of Denman Hammond, who I think has been through one of these interviews. And Denny was head of hematology oncology at Children's Hospital. Came to the dean's office under Franz Bauer about the time I came here, just after that, and started to build a cancer center. So he put together plans for a standalone building that was going to be a USC county joint effort,
Mm-hmm.
at a building that was going to be built on the county land. It had to be supported by a proposition. The voters had to approve it, and unfortunately came up short. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, maybe fortunately, by just a small amount. And USC decided to go ahead, largely because of Denny's initiative and a contribution from the Norris Foundation. Ken Norris got involved, and the Norris family has a long history with USC, and Ken Norris got himself involved in this, and so he gave a gift and together with other money raised and a big grant from the National Cancer Institute, we built the first of the Norris cancer buildings. That was going up in late 70s, early 80s, when Denny stepped down in 1981 as head of the Cancer Center. I was involved in the Cancer Center as an associate director by then because of the epidemiology program. We were a strong part of it, always have been. Dick O'Brien took over for a while, Richard O'Brien from pathology, then he went off to Creighton. And so by the fall of 82, here was this beautiful building going up. There was a plan. It had a hospital in it, a 60-bed hospital, outpatient clinics, and research labs, but not a terribly well worked out plan as to how it was all going to work. It was the first private beds, hospital beds, I think any kind that had been on the campus, on the USC campus, USC owned. So it was a big undertaking. So anyway, I was asked by Alan Mathias to take on the role of director of the Cancer Center in 82, which I did. And then I had the interesting challenge of trying to open the hospital, get a faculty who could recruit patients, and get the scientists together to build a scientific program that would defend this big investment.
Tell me who you recruited.
So it was a fascinating time. On the clinical side, the key people were Alexander Levine. Sandy was in hematology at the county hospital, done all of her training at USC. And Sandy came and brought, if you will, the soul of the Norris. She has a strong compassion for people with cancer and AIDS. Sandy's a wonderful physician. And so she had a huge impact on the nursing staff in just telling them the feel of what of what we wanted to build was like. What was the Norris going to be like? It was going to be a really caring institution that people would know when you came to the Norris, you were going to get the best care, and it was going to be done in a way that was compassionate, patient-centered. So Sandy was the soul, but the heart, or if you will, of what we built was Don Skinner. Don Skinner had already a reputation as a urologic surgeon with kidney and bladder cancer. Don was at Good Samaritan Hospital at the time, having moved from UCLA to USC. So Don brought his patient population into the Norris as it opened in 83. And without that, we would have never made it. We looked at some red ink for the first 2 years. And the whole university was nervous. Would we succeed or fail? But just about then, Don Skinner came up with a Coke pouch, which is a way of treating people with bladder cancer by, if you have to remove the bladder, by creating a second bladder out of bowel. And he derived it from a surgeon in Sweden by the name of Koch. Anyway, that brought patients and income and allowed the Norris to flourish on the clinical side. On the basic science side, Peter Vogt was in the Hoffman building. I got Peter to move in. I got Amy Lee to move in, who'd just come from Caltech as a postdoc, young faculty. And together with Don Skinner, we got Peter Jones to move from Children's Hospital. So we had those basic scientists along with the epidemiologists and this growing clinical group, and that was really the core of the Norris in those early years.
Yeah, you did a great job with recruiting. It grew so much, in fact, that by 1987, it was ripe for expansion. 5 years after the opening, the university announced a campaign for an addition that would include outpatient facilities, laboratories, and offices. And the Norris Foundation committed a lead gift of $4.5 million toward construction. So now I want you to talk about the expansion of what became the Dr. Norman Topping Tower.
Yeah, that's a curious story too. So I had this idea. We were growing fast, as you said, and we needed more space. We needed more clinical space because the original building is designed in the 70s, envisaged that people with cancer would be inpatients for their chemotherapy. By the time we opened in '83, the transition to outpatient therapy had already started. So people no longer needed to be in bed to get intravenous chemotherapy. They could get it as outpatients. But we had virtually no outpatient space, crammed into one room, one reasonably sized room, but still one room to do all the outpatient chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. So we had to expand. We didn't need more beds, but we needed clinic space. We needed office space for the physicians. They were mostly housed still over at the county hospital, and yet some of them spent all their time at the Norris. So we needed space for Skinner's group, for the hematology group of Feinstein and Levine, Peter Rosen and others. We needed to give them space, and we needed space for the epidemiology group who were in the Edmondson building or in Parkview building and growing and nowhere to expand to. So I came up with a budget of $22 million. It's not quite clear how I came up with that budget because the building cost $79.
Oh my gosh.
But I got approval from the university based on the $22 million estimate I had, which included a major gift that I got from the Norris Foundation.
Right.
So the university agreed to go ahead, and then everybody had to deal with the fact that the building was a lot more expensive than we thought. And the key to that was Norman Topping. Norman had been chancellor of, was chancellor of the university, was well loved in the community, had a lot of contacts, and Norman Topping went out and helped raise a lot of the money we needed to make up this deficit between my projections and the reality.
Well, my notes say that we gained 25 new laboratories,
Right.
tripled the size of the outpatient clinics, and more than quintupled its pathology lab space.
Yep.
That was...
And the office space for the physicians and the office space for preventive medicine. Where you and I still are today, where our group are today, that all was built at that time.
And then just briefly talk in 1998, $5 million gift from local philanthropist Henrietta Lee to establish the endowed chairs and the Henrietta Lee Breast Center.
Yeah, something that Peter Jones and Bill Watson, who was head of development, the two of them were instrumental in getting those gifts. By then I had left the Cancer Center. I left as director in 1992. Peter Jones took over as director, and he's still director today. So he's been in office for over 15 years. I went down to the Salk Institute in San Diego as president for 3+ years. A kind of curious transition in my life. It didn't quite work out the way I thought. And for good reasons, I came back to USC in 95, 96. But anyway, it was my sort of venture away from USC, the only one I had. I think the only one I'll have until I finish my career.
Well, and you left somebody very good in charge of your very important multi-ethnic cohort study.
Right, you.
Anyway, you had a major role in establishing the multi-ethnic cohort. Tell us about the study, but start by telling us the background behind your idea.
Yeah, so I mentioned I had these meetings during the 70s and 80s of epidemiologists from around the Pacific, Japan, Singapore, the Philippines, eventually China, Alaska, down in Peru, and we'd all meet in Hawaii for 5 days every 3 years. So I got to know a lot of people in the Pacific, obviously, that way. And I decided to have another sabbatical when I was director of the Cancer Center. So in 1987, I took a sabbatical to go to Japan. It was 87, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 87. And I was going to work in the laboratory of a Japanese pathologist, epidemiologist at the National Cancer Institute of Japan, which is in Tokyo. Mm-hmm. So off I went with my wife and my youngest son, and we were supposed to have housing there. And well, anyway, we arrived there, and the housing wasn't quite what we had in mind. And there wasn't anybody who spoke English in the lab, except this pathologist who was never there. So there was a lot of downtime, to say the least. And I found I really didn't have a lot to do, which was probably the best thing that could have happened. Because I sat there, I was well along in my career by 1987, but I knew I had to do something different to keep my career going. You know, what could I do now differently going forward? And it was there I thought of doing something like what Walter Willett and his colleagues had done, Frank Spicer at Harvard. They started in the 70s a prospective study of nurses from the United States. Became very famous, known as the Nurses' Health Study. It was the cancer equivalent of the Framingham studies of heart disease, which preceded it. Prospective studies, you interview people and collect blood specimens from them at the beginning, then you follow them and you watch what happens. And you compare outcomes like heart disease in Framingham or cancer in the Nurses' Health Study. You follow people with the outcomes and compare them to everybody else who is in your prospective group and doesn't have disease. And I thought, well, it works so well in the nurses, why wouldn't it be good to do that in the multi-ethnic population, which we had found so important in Los Angeles? But one piece that was missing in Los Angeles was in Hawaii, which was access to more Japanese, to the native Hawaiian population. And because things weren't working out in Tokyo, I called my friend in Hawaii, Dr. Larry Colonel, at the University of Hawaii Cancer Center, and I said, how would you like a visitor for 2 months? And he was gracious enough to accept me, and I went there with Judy, my wife, Judith, and Michael, my son, and we moved to Hawaii then for the last part of my sabbatical. And between us, we came up with the idea, that is between Dr. Colonel, myself, and Gene Henkin, who's a nutritionist, Abe Nomura, Malcolm Pike back at SC, we came up with this idea of a prospective study of multiple different ethnic populations. And that's sort of the background. You came in at the very early days of that as we were piloting it. And
we actually piloted 8 ethnic groups.
8 ethnic groups. And eventually we were convinced by the reviewers at the National Cancer Institute of our grants that we should get more people in fewer groups than fewer people in more groups. So we ended up with 5 ethnic groups. And in 1992 we were funded. We got the multi-ethnic cohort started among Japanese, whites, Latinos, African Americans, and Native Hawaiians.
Okay.
We enrolled by mail between Hawaii and Los Angeles, 215,000 people. And we've been following those people ever since. And it's become a very famous study, very productive study.
And just discuss briefly the endpoints that we're currently studying?
Well, we have from the beginning looked at the common cancers like breast, prostate, colorectal.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a lot of dietary information, which you've been using successfully, and others. We had other outcome data like cigarette smoking, of course, hormone replacement therapy use, and other information about vitamin intake and things like that. So we've looked at outcomes of the common cancers. We've begun to explore diabetes and heart disease in this large cohort. And so as we go forward, it becomes a richer and richer source of information for scientific inquiry.
And one of your philosophies has always been to bring in as many different investigators as possible. And so you're willing to share the data.
Share the data. And when I was down at the Salk Institute, even though I wasn't too excited about my job as president down there as it worked out, I was exposed to the growing information from molecular biology among all the new young people being recruited to the Salk. Because the Salk Institute was able to attract really, really good postdocs from every good lab in the country and across the seas. So you'd hear them talk, and they all talked about molecular genetics and that growing field. And it got me thinking about genetics as the basis for much of the susceptibility that we have to chronic diseases, not just to the diseases you might think of, like in the Jewish community, Tay-Sachs and Gaucher's disease, or other genetic, even cancers like retinoblastoma that are obviously genetic. But to think about chronic diseases as due to variations between us in susceptibility to these cancers, and that it had a genetic basis. So to me, the multi-ethnic cohort was more than a cohort to study diet and other exposures and cancer. It was the opportunity to really look at the contribution of genetic susceptibility to outcomes.
So talk a little bit then about the additional grant that you received.
So when I got back, even while I was at the Salk Institute, I wrote the first round of a grant with Ron Ross's help. Ron came down for a year as a visiting faculty member, and Heather Feigelson joined me as a graduate student there. And I started with the first grant of looking at normal genetic variation and its risk and how it affected your risk to chronic disease like cancer. And the first grant focused on breast and prostate cancer. It didn't actually get funded till I got back at USC in '95, but it was a large part of my attraction and wanting to come back to USC, because I saw the multi-ethnic cohort as vital to really pursuing that interest of mine. So I got it funded. We got funded in the 90s, 96 maybe?
I think so.
Yeah, we started collecting blood from people who got cancer and from random controls among the members of the cohort we were following. And then later we got money to collect blood from a lot more people.
Right.
And that work just keeps expanding.
And it's important to point out that you have, I think, about 36,000 specimens in Los Angeles.
Right.
And the genetic susceptibility was also funded in Hawaii, and they contribute about 39,000 specimens, which is just an incredible resource.
Yeah, it gives us a huge resource, which we're just now beginning to really tap, because now we have the technology to really study genetic susceptibility.
And you're one of the few cohorts in the country that can contribute that kind of information with that number of specimens.
That number of specimens, and certainly with the ethnic diversity. Every other study that's done these days and published, virtually every other study is among a Caucasian group in Europe, the UK or the United States, like the Nurses' Health Study Group. And we have virtually the only data on non-Caucasian populations. So we fill a really vital gap. And we're right now, it's helping us get funded in a major way.
Right. Well, we'll come back to your current research after we talk a little bit about the Zilkha Neurogenetic Institute. Could you just provide a little bit of background about the Zilkha?
So I'm back in 1995 or so, and I don't have a lot to do, as much to do as I did before. I'm not running the Salk Institute. I'm no longer running the Cancer Center. The multi-ethnic cohort study is just sort of beginning, right? We're mailing questionnaires. We don't have a lot of data yet. I'm actually driving everybody nuts because I don't have enough to do. And Steve Ryan is dean, and he also happens to be on the board of the Keck Foundation. And the Keck Foundation is beginning to give large grants to Southern California institutions, private institutions. So they give a big grant to Caltech for the Keck telescopes on Mauna Kea. And then they give another big gift to the Scripps or the Claremont schools to build a biomedical research training program. And so there's an opportunity for USC. And USC applies with its proposal to get, I think, $50 million from the Keck Foundation. In 1995, while I'm still at the Salk Institute, they don't succeed. So Steve Ryan comes to me and says, will I put something together for the Keck Foundation gift? And there's a very, very bright woman in our development program there, Noelle Tysius. And so I get access to her. So I put together a proposal with her that sort of looks like the cancer proposal, center proposal that Denny Hammond put together in the early 70s.
Okay.
It's a bit of smoke and mirrors because it talks about doing things we're not really doing with people we don't really have, as if it's possible almost overnight to make the transition. But it's good enough that we get funded, and the key part of it is to build an institute to study neuroscience. And because neuroscience is widely used, we called it the Neurogenetic Institute. Give it a little different spin. And it led to the Keck Foundation gift, which then went, because of work that President Sample did with Robert Day, who was chairman of the board, they worked out, the proposal went from 50 to over 100 million and brought the medical school its first really large endowment gift and enough money to build a Neurogenetic Institute. Along the way, Robert Day and Steve Ryan talked Salim Zilkha into giving $20 million towards the naming of the building. And so the building went up, and it's been up and open since 2003.
Talk a little bit about the kind of research that's going on and the faculty that are housed there.
So yeah, there was, I think, to me, what we needed to do in neuroscience was what we had needed to do in cancer, which was we needed space for basic scientists. We have a strong clinical program at the medical school, but basic science has always been thin. And to me, you can't have a strong medical school if you don't have strong basic science. So I wanted a laboratory building, so that's what I built. 5 floors of labs, 4 floors of 6 labs to a floor, and then a basement vivarium. And the building was driven from start to finish by my desire to have labs and a minimum of offices, but places for people to do laboratory research. So when we started recruiting, first we went out after a real director, because I was director, but I'm not a neuroscientist. I brought Jeannie Chen, who was a neuroscientist working in the Doheny Eye Institute, in as an early faculty member, and Ralph Langen, a young man who'd been at Caltech and UCLA and was doing imaging, brought him in early on. And then we went off after young faculty from around the United States. By then, Zach Hall was here advising Steve Ryan, and Zach was a neuroscientist. He'd been head of the NIH's Neurological Disease Institute for a few years, and at UC San Francisco for several years, where he built a neuroscience program. So he and I, together with Jeannie Chen, and then began to recruit good young scientists from the best labs we could get them from. So we got them from Cold Spring Harbor, from Stanford, from University of Washington, from WashU, and built up 14 or 15 faculty who are now the core of that institute, and the hope is now it keeps growing and expanding.
Well, it's not any surprise, given that you were so involved with establishing the Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center and the Zilkha, why the university would then tap you to lead the medical school. So I want to talk now about your appointment as dean.
So I got to say at the outset, I was a reluctant recruit as dean. I think Steve Ryan before me had been reluctant, but he had been dean for 12 years. And when he stepped down, it was somewhat suddenly. There was a lot of things going on at the medical school at the time, and a lot of stress and strain between the medical school and the university, which has not been uncommon on and off over the years. 2 different campuses. Medical school has a different view of the world than the university does often. So President Sample asked me to be the dean, and I said I would do it, but I would only do it for a limited period of time. So we agreed that I wouldn't be an interim dean, but in announcement, but in fact, in reality. So I said I would do this in June of 2004. And it was a challenging position, to say the least. I did it for almost 3.5 years, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Well, a number of significant changes have occurred during your tenure. New programs, a major building program, and new areas within the university. Tell us about those programs.
Well, so I think the central theme to what I tried to do as dean was to continue to expand basic science. The Zilkha was just beginning to move. Peter Jones had, with Steve Ryan, already arranged a new addition to the Norris, which was another tower, but all research, this one, named after Harlene Norris, who was then head of the Norris Foundation. So that building was starting up as I became dean. So that meant we were, more expansion of basic science. And then came the California Stem Cell Initiative, which allowed me the opportunity to recruit a major person in stem cell research. And so I was able to get Martin Parrott from Australia. So we built strong programs in basic science, or I hope there'll be strong programs in basic science. And then I worked hard to try to find a way to get the clinical programs to move into the future. We had the county hospital as a partner. They're an important partner, but we needed a private hospital. It's owned by a for-profit group. It was obvious to me, and I think now obvious to the university, that we had to own our own hospital to control our own destiny. So I worked hard to get the seeds to grow within the university, the idea that we really had to own that hospital. And so now we're in a lawsuit trying to gain control. So I'd say those are the things I worked the most on, the things that I felt I accomplished or got started enough to try to accomplish while I was dean.
Okay. Is there anything else that you want to add about your tenure as dean, or should we go to my final question?
No, your final question.
Okay. I want you to tell us about the various activities in which you're currently engaged after your tenure as dean, your plans for the future, and what is the most pressing research question that you would like to see answered in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so I really want to see the genetic work that I started grow and provide. We have already found a most amazing, we've found the genetic basis of prostate cancer in the last 2 years. Our work in a big cohort in Iceland and another one in England, Cambridge, have all shown the same thing, that there's an area of the human genome where there are alleles that put you at risk, genetic changes, genetic variations that put you at risk of prostate cancer. And that virtually all prostate cancer has that genetic basis. So much like we hypothesized in the early 90s, we've already shown it's true in prostate cancer. But there are major things, similar things to find about breast cancer, colorectal cancer, other human cancers, diabetes, and heart disease. And the multiethnic cohort is really an important part of providing the information to solve those questions. So I want to be able to be a part of that over the next however long I can contribute. Because I believe that that will lead to the age of personal medicine, personalized medicine, where you will, early on in your life, find out your genetic susceptibility to diabetes, to heart disease, to breast cancer, to prostate cancer, and be able to be prescribed the preventive path you should follow, matched with your genetic background. And that will transform medicine from being one flavor serves all to an individual approach that I'm sure I won't be here to see, the end of it, or maybe I'll be here, but I certainly won't be active, probably, as active as I am now. But we're there. We're there. This is happening today in this field, and a few centers around the world are contributing the information, and we're one of them. So I want to see us seize the opportunity we have, the rich resource we have in the multi-ethnic cohort, all the work you've done and I've done and our colleagues have done, and really take it to the next step. That's what I'd like to do, and that's where I'd like to see us be in another 3 or 4 years.
Okay, so then you'll still have plenty of time left for your next vision.
That's right.
Okay, did I leave anything out that you
No,
would
you
like?
did a terrific job.
Okay.
And you're very gracious to do this, Chris. Thanks very much.
You're
You've been a
welcome.
great colleague, and it's fun working together. It's been nice of you to do this interview.
Thank you. Thank you.